Welcome to A Dose of Feel Good. I'm your host, Whitney Bischoff, and today we are talking about if you feel like no one understands, small dose healing space. You can see full show notes at doseoffeelgood.my.canva.site. Now let's dive into today's episode. Welcome back to another episode of Dose of Feel Good, and we are jumping into our final episode of our series, so thank you for tuning in each week and going with me on this journey. If you haven't had a chance to take a look at the stickers that accompany this series, I would highly recommend going over to our Etsy shop and taking a look at those. There might just be a reminder or two in there that can just act as that space that reminds us to find the good in the world when it is especially difficult. But I want to dive in this week. I have been telling folks that this entire podcast journey has been especially healing for me. And we're going to be talking about what it means to find a healing space, especially when we feel like no one understands, and how can they possibly when we are all experiencing our own things and our own journeys. So it can oftentimes feel like no one understands, and legitimately, how can they? And I think this stems from comparison culture, and we have this constant bombardment in our faces of everybody else's life. We are just overstimulated all the time by messages of who has it better or who has it worse, by the news, by social media. And so we live currently in this culture of amplification of who has it better, who has it worse. And I think that can lend us to really feeling like no one understands, because we just have these messages of everybody else's life. And so we're comparing it to our own journeys and our own things that we are going through. And so it can lend us to this feeling of that we know everything about everyone else, but how can they possibly understand us? Because we don't put everything that we're going through out to the world. So it's this really weird dynamic that we feel like we know everything that everyone else is going through, but they don't know everything we're going through. And that's just not the reality. It's such a facade when you really think about it, when you get down to the nitty-gritty reality of it. That, they're, along with ourselves, we're only putting our best out there on display. And it can really, I think, mess with us a little bit, because I think sometimes, and especially even for myself, like, people, I think, sometimes have this idea maybe of who I am because that's what I have put out into the world from what everybody is seeing. And I think sometimes then when that narrative changes, or when that idea changes for whatever reason, it's almost like, in this culture of, all of a sudden or even for yourself, like, you're all of a sudden canceled, right? Like, we all know what that means. And because that idea of what has been put out into the universe all of a sudden shifts. And so it's like, oh, well, they're not being authentic because that doesn't fit the idea of what I've put out there. And the reality is that, like, there's only so much that you can put into those spaces. And being authentic to who you are is totally different. If we didn't have social media, if we didn't have the news, if we didn't have this picture perfect version that we put out into the world, because we choose then what we can put out there. And we control that narrative. It's not the everyday bumps and bruises version. That's not the authentic piece. And so I think then we get into this space where we genuinely feel like no one understands. And so I think we have to take a moment and ask ourselves, is this the perception that no one understands? Or have we given the space? Is the reality that we haven't given people the space to just be with us in our true authentic space, the bumps, the bruises, just authentically how we are? Or have we curated this version that just isn't real? And I think that's where we can get in trouble in this space that we're like, no one understands because I've curated this space or this version of myself that just isn't even real. And then I know, at least for me, like, I'm like, oh, now I feel like I have to put on this face or this facade that is based on the version that I've created. And I've done this to myself effectively, right? So that's how we then have to enter into this healing space. We have to be comfortable with maybe changing from that version that we've put out into the world. So that's where I want to go with our story here today. When I think about like someone that I've looked up to, oftentimes we focus on the things that, you know, they've done really well or the things that we admire. And I think oftentimes we should also think of this vulnerable state that we realize that they've struggled too. We all struggle, and we admire the way that they've maybe gone through those hard times or those things that they've that have challenged them. And I think when we think of that in other people, it's easier for us to kind of wrap our head around it of like, oh, we admire that strength in others. And it is difficult to kind of wrap our heads around that in ourselves. But I know oftentimes, like, I hear this a lot, or people say this to me of like, when I, you know, start to share some of the things that I've gone through, and I tend to be careful about what I share, because I never want it to be turned around and used against me. Like, there is a huge trust element when you are vulnerable. But I often hear people say, like, I never would have guessed that about you. And I think it's because, like I said, I've been careful about putting on this front or this narrative of how people view me. And so I think every time I hear that, I'm like, it's almost this realization for me that, you know, it's okay to let people in and let them know that, like, you know, we do experience hard things, and it's all about how you respond. And I think when I started to feel more comfortable and trust people with sharing those bumps and bruises, if you will, it wasn't so that, you know, trying to seek where other people are going to understand, because they're not going to understand, right? There are some really hard things that I've gone through that no one's going to understand, because they were not living my life in those moments. They're not currently living my life. And everyone experiences life differently. We all experience things in different spaces, but we can show up for each other. We can understand that we all experience challenge. That is a universal human experience, and we can show up together. That's where that feeling of no one might understand, but we don't have to go through it alone. We can show up for each other in those spaces. And I think that is an incredibly powerful realization, that we're showing up together in our authentic human experience. And I think that's where that healing journey starts to come from. And I think the impact of this is in a couple of different ways. And it's going to hurt a little bit before it starts to feel better. And when we're talking about a dose of feel good, healing is hard. But ultimately, that dose of feel good comes from allowing ourselves that healing space. So I want to challenge us a little bit. First, stop watching news sources or even following people on social media that make you question yourself. Just stop. That was the first part of my healing journey. I went through and I very carefully removed people from my social media. If it didn't lift me up, it needed to be gone. And it was the same, like, I just knew whether that was news sources or, I mean, I get a lot of my news from social media. I just completely cut that off because I knew I needed to heal. And I didn't want to question myself in any of those spaces anymore. I wanted to build myself up in a very authentic way. And healing starts when we lean into that authenticity, even the ugly sides of what that looks like for us. And I think that can be difficult. It can be hard for people when we're doing that hard work. It can be hard for people to want to join us on that journey. But the real people in our lives, they're still going to show up. And that's what we need in those moments. We don't need people who are going to question us on that journey, who are going to be like, what are you doing? Who are you? Who are you now, right? We need people who are going to help us be our best. And it's gonna hurt to see that fat trimmed, if you will. And I say that in a way of like, there's going to be people in your life that aren't going to be on that, aren't going to want to go along that journey with you. And it's going to hurt. It's going to suck in the moment. But once you've done that, it's so liberating to have the people who show up and help you realize how incredible you are. And I think you will also find people who you will eventually meet who are going to walk with you on that healed journey. And they're not going to make you question it for a second. There are so many people, as I've really come into this healed space, that I'm like, I don't know if I would have taken a chance on myself or, even trusted them to be my friend and support me on this journey if I would have not healed or trimmed in the other spaces. Because, we only have so much time and attention to really lean into the authentic relationships in our life. And so we can't be everything to everyone, but we can really focus our time and attention to the people who matter and who are going to support us along that journey as well. So I'm going to kind of recap here for our call to action, because a lot of it is like, how do we get to a space where we are focused on what healing looks like for us? First, again, stop watching news sources or following people on social media that make you question yourself. Just cut those pieces out. The second piece is really ask yourself, what do you need people to understand? Like, what is that piece that you're hoping people understand? Or do you just need space to heal? Do you just need that space for people to show up for you? What does that look like for you? Like, what would that look like where you're like, oh, people finally understand me. They're finally showing up for me. What does that actually look like in practice? The third piece, and this is really, really difficult, is trim the fat in your life of the people who are not supporting your healing journey, who are making you question yourself, who are making your life hard. You don't need that. You do not need that. And they shouldn't be making your life more difficult. And the last piece is more of a reminder and letting you know that while it might feel like no one understands, that really great reminder that struggle is a human, universal thing that we all go through. just in our own unique way. And I think when we realize that, it can make it a little less lonely. So with that, if you've made it to the end of the episode, I will be putting some graphics out on social media as I do each week. But if you comment on them this week, I am going to be giving away some sticker packs to celebrate that we have made it to the end of the series. So if you comment on any of our graphics this week on Instagram, you will be entered to win some of those sticker packs. So we'll be giving away a handful of those. So make sure to comment and share this episode this week. Otherwise, we will be jumping into all of the fun regular episodes. I know we've missed those for the past 14 weeks, so it has been a while since we've done a regular episode. So I'm excited to share those with you all next week.
Thank you so much for listening, and I hope you are feeling ready to conquer the week and let your impact ripple out to the world around you. Let's connect on Instagram and Threads at Dose of Feel Good Podcast. If you're loving the podcast, I'd love it if you'd hit that subscribe button and leave a review. Until next time, share your own dose of feel good and never underestimate the power of positivity.